Excellent. Okay, welcome back, viewers and listeners. This is a pretty exciting episode for Maniac and I because it's number 50. Number 2 in season 5. And we're really excited to introduce a guest today, which is Aaron the Knife Jabs. You might remember that name, or at least be familiar with it, because it comes up in our liner notes all the time. He is the composer of our outro music and was very kind enough to just send it to us and say, hey, if you want to use it, go ahead. So we appreciate that.
Thank you,
it's a really nice outro. So a little bit different today. We are not going to do a review, but I think we're doing our most anticipated of the year.
Yes, as a special bonus, our top 5 most anticipated films of 2024.
But we're not doing quick cuts.
Correct.
Okay. So yeah, a little bit different. We're not doing a movie review. Aaron is here to join us for a conversation. If you've listened to a few of our episodes, this comes up over and over and over again. So we often have the conversation about, is this a horror movie? And we've used the term horror adjacent, I think, many times. Is it on the cusp? Is it functioning like a different kind of movie?
Does it have horror elements?
Yeah, horror elements. So anyway, all that to say, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed this episode. It's a bit of a departure. I'm going to turn it over to Mike because we're going to start things with a little bit of a game, I think.
Yeah, so I thought it'd be fun. I am a gamer, and I know Aaron is a gamer, so I thought we'd start with a little game today. And the game is it horror? So how this is going to work, I'm going to list off different films, and we are all going to instantly decide whether we think it is horror or not horror. So we've got signs here. If you are watching on YouTube, we will have signs saying whether it is horror.
Indeed. We've got these signs here.
Or not horror. And if you are just listening and you don't want to go to YouTube, then I'll make sure we actually say it too at the same time. So maybe every time I give the film, we'll go Lee, and then Aaron, and then I'll
okay,
go,
for sure.
So that people who are just listening won't see the signs will know.
Okay.
So as a caveat, I don't know if these gentlemen have seen all of these movies or they maybe have not seen them in a long time. Some of these are going to be kind of tough maybe to determine whether they are truly horror or not horror. So don't hold us to these. As sometimes you got to go back and rewatch it through that lens to truly decide. But this is kind of just a gut feeling.
Before we start the game, I forgot to do one thing. Can I give a shout out to the lady that made our mugs and our hoodies? I think the shirts were made somewhere different.
Yeah, we've got Dudes of the Dead swag now.
Yeah, so this was made by Ashley. Now, as far as I know, she doesn't have a website, but if you go on Facebook, it's Made Wild VI. So all one word, Made Wild VI for Vancouver Island. And I just wanted to give a shout out to her. And she does, I think she might have some kind of Cricut device. So she does clothing, she does mugs, probably buttons and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, thank you very much, Ashley. We're pretty stoked about having the mugs and also having the sweatshirts as well as the t-shirts. I think, Mike, you said we can now promote in all kinds of weather. So
that's right. Yeah, we can advertise all over town.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
All right. And listeners and viewers, you can play at home as well. So when I say the film in your mind, you can think, or you can even say it out loud, is it horror or is it not horror? And then we'll give our thoughts. We're not going to do a deep discussion on all these or else we'll be here for 7 hours, but just kind of a gut feeling.
And this is not Jay of the Dead, so we'll keep it shorter than 7 hours.
We'll try. Yeah. All right. So first film, gentlemen.
I'm ready.
Is Flatliners.
Ooh. Not horror.
Aaron?
Oh.
Not horror. Sorry.
Yeah. I would say horror as well. So we have 2 horror, 1 not horror.
And I've actually seen the original and the remake, and I've been trying to think, is that enough horror elements? I don't know. So I kind of guessed on that one.
Okay.
So it wasn't clear in my mind.
I was thinking the original, but...
Yeah, fair enough. Okay.
Okay,
By the way, this is one of my favorite parts of the podcast with you guys when you have these discussions of horror, not horror. I'm really excited to be here and talk about this.
Excellent.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Thanks for coming.
Wait a minute, is that actually a horror movie? It's great.
And it seems to be a trend on a lot of horror podcasts. And I think we'll get into why, but it is more than other films. It does seem, or more than other genres, horror seems a little bit harder to always pin down.
Yeah.
Okay. Speaking of which, film number 2, one we've reviewed in the past, Silence of the Lambs.
I have to, not horror.
I'm going to say not.
I'm going to say horror. So that's 2 not horrors, 1 horror.
There we go.
Okay. Film number 3. So remember to hold up your sign and say it. Rocky Horror Picture Show.
Not horror.
Not horror.
Not horror.
Okay.
All right, we all
Thank
agree
you.
on that
Even though
one.
it has horror in the title.
Okay, this one was interesting. Jurassic Park.
Oh,
This one, that's
Not horror.
That's tough. I'm gonna say not.
I'm gonna say horror.
you're talking the original, right?
That's right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Fair.
Because I was trying to distinguish the differences between Jurassic Park and Jaws, and I consider Jaws a horror film, and I feel like
Good point.
Jurassic Park operates very similarly, but that's why we're doing the game.
Yeah, these are good examples.
Okay,
To go into.
we'll see if you've seen this one. My Boyfriend's Back.
I haven't
I
seen
haven't
it.
actually seen this.
Okay,
Sorry.
so it's about
I'm gonna guess though. I'm gonna say not horror.
yeah,
Sounds like
it's
a horror comedy.
horror comedy
Yeah.
romance.
Is
I
it
would
Mike-
say
is
not
this-
horror.
Mike Myers.
No, that's So I Married an Axe
Oh, right,
Murderer.
right, right.
Yeah. Yeah, my boyfriend's back. Her boyfriend dies and comes back as a zombie.
Oh, okay.
Right.
It's kind of like Beauty and the Beast, and then the villagers try to go after.
Oh,
him.
okay.
All
Okay.
right.
Something to watch.
Very curious to see what you think about this one. Requiem for a Dream.
Ooh,
Yeah, not horror
that's
for
one of
me.
my favorite movies growing up.
It's so good.
I'm
But is it horror?
gonna go with horror on this one.
Okay, I'm going to say not horror, but I could be persuaded either way.
I think this is interesting. It's gonna go in. We'll talk about it more, but I'm
Okay.
gonna say horror.
Now, this one I know is one Jay of the Dead contentiously considers to be horror. The Terminator.
Ooh,
Yeah, sorry. Not horror for me.
that's interesting. I'm gonna say not horror.
I'm going to say horror. I rewatched the trailer and I think, he claims it operates kind of like a slasher film, which I can kind of see. So
Huh.
being
Interesting.
stalked by a
Okay.
murderer. Anyways,
I'm
yeah,
not convinced.
Watch-
maybe we'll have to do episodes on all these films. in the
Yeah,
future.
exactly. Exactly.
Okay, another one you may or may not have seen, Hocus Pocus
Ooh.
with Sarah Jessica Parker.
Yeah, I know which I've seen scenes, but not the whole thing.
I'll say horror for that one.
I'm gonna guess because I haven't seen the whole thing, which isn't fair, but I'm gonna say not horror.
Yeah, I'm going to lean horror as well.
Okay, there you go. There might be more horror elements.
All right, Nightmare Before Christmas, Tim Burton.
Ooh, it's been a long time.
Ooh,
Ooh, that's a tough one.
I know.
that is tough.
I'm
but
gonna say
go-
not
I'm
horror.
gonna go not horror.
I'm going to go horror.
You're
And I
just
think
being
there's a
contrarian. I think that's what's going on.
well, one thing I want to talk about today is there such a category as kids horror?
Okay,
Yeah.
fair.
And I don't know.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that.
Yeah, okay.
This one got labeled as horror, but I think is a bit contentious. Parasite.
Yeah, I saw this on people's lists. Oh, I'm probably gonna contradict myself at some point, but I'm gonna say it's not
Yeah, I'm
horror.
gonna say not horror.
Yeah, I'm going to say not horror as well.
Outstanding
that
film.
was on like all the horror. lists,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah,
Mhm.
exactly.
Okay, just a few more. The Little Shop of Horrors with Steve
Oh,
Martin.
man.
Rick
No,
Moranis.
not horror.
Yeah, I'm gonna say not horror for that one.
Yeah, I'm going to go not horror as well. It's close, but not quite.
I get why it could be.
Yeah,
either, though.
yeah.
Zombieland.
Ooh. Horror comedies are so tough.
They are.
Yeah, I'm gonna say not horror.
Oh, see, I was going to go horror
I think we're
for.
gonna specifically talk about this one again later, but
Okay. Donnie Darko.
I'm gonna say the same
Ooh.
thing. Not horror for me. I love that film though.
That one's closer. Let me say horror.
Okay, I'm going to go not horror, but it has some scenes with a lot of horror elements. So that one's, again, I've chosen ones that are difficult on purpose.
Yeah,
Okay,
A lot of these are very
Yeah,
close
good choices
and
because they're making me think.
All right, two more. So
Okay.
Blue Velvet.
This one, I actually don't know if I've seen Blue Velvet. There's a bunch of movies that happen in that era that are very similar.
For sure.
Lost Highway. And
It's David
stuff like
Lynch.
that.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
really
yeah.
Can't really remember which one is which.
They do all kind of blend together.
I said not horror.
If it's what I'm thinking is not horror.
Yeah, I struggled with this one a lot, but I'm going to say not
Yeah.
horror. All right, and the final one. This might be the most difficult one.
Okay. Wow.
The Room with Tommy Wiseau.
Not horror.
Okay.
Although it is horrific.
It's horrific.
Yeah, horror for sure. Very horrific.
Horror comedy.
Yeah. All
Sorry,
right,
Tommy.
So thanks for playing at home. You may strongly disagree with some of our picks there, but I
Yeah.
think this illustrates the point that it's very difficult in some cases, in these edge cases especially, when it's bleeding into horror thriller or horror drama or horror comedy. What exactly makes a horror film? And so we want to take some time today to get into what makes a horror film. So before, I think we'll do a roundtable. We'll go around and everyone kind of give their thoughts on what a horror film is. But just as a starting point, what better place than Wikipedia
Totally.
to figure out
Yeah,
what horror is?
Totally.
So according to
Standard.
Wikipedia, horror is a film genre that seeks to elicit fear or disgust in its audience for entertainment purposes. Horror films often explore dark subject matter and may deal with transgressive topics or themes. Broad elements include monsters, apocalyptic events, and religious or folk beliefs. So according to Wikipedia, that is their thought. But maybe I'll throw it over to our special guest, Aaron the Knife Jabs. In your
Sure.
opinion, what is a horror film?
It's a very difficult question. You asked me this question like what, a month or two ago,
Mm-hmm.
and I thought it was going to be easy. And then when I tried to actually like put my thoughts to words, it was very difficult.
That's my experience too.
It's like asking someone like what is fun. Like
Yeah,
it's like you know what it feels like, but it's really hard to put into words what that is.
That's a good comparison.
So the first thing I did, obviously, is like go to Wikipedia. What is this? And I wasn't satisfied with that definition, so I made my own and wrote it down so that it would just be clear in my head. So
Cool.
this is what I got.
Okay.
So a horror movie is made when a director attempts to elicit a visceral reaction, and I think that's important. It's not just it's like a deep down feeling. It's not just something. It's just not like having a zombie in a movie doesn't make it a horror movie.
Mm.
It has to actually make you feel something. So a director attempts to elicit a visceral reaction to horrific elements, and all of those elements semantic intent.
Ooh.
So,
Wow.
and then I have the horror elements, just basic ones. It's like fear, shock, disgust, distress, anxiety, and malevolence.
Hmm.
Those are just some basics. There's a lot, but I think
You
This-
should update the Wikipedia definition of that one.
That's right. Yeah.
the
You can get away with
semantic,
it.
the semantic intent part is really important in my thought process of this because those words mean different things to different people.
Yeah.
I think it's semantics is like a big issue right now, kind of for a lot of people.
Totally.
And so, depending on how you were brought up, if you were
Mm.
religious growing up, those horror elements can have different meanings for you
Totally. Yeah.
and how they come across. So, I think when I say semantic intent, both of those words are really important because it's how you interpret the words. But also, I think when you're making a horror movie, there has to be intent for it to be horrific in a way.
Right.
And when we played the game at the beginning, some of those ones where we were disagreeing, I think a large part of it for me is saying something's not horror is because the director didn't intend for it to be horror.
Yes.
And even though you might feel fear or shock or disgust or any of those horror elements, they weren't intended.
Right.
And it depends on like a myriad of different things in your background, how you grew up.
Totally.
Again.
So for you, the creator and what their intent and goal is heading into a project kind of defines.
I think that's probably the most important thing for me when I'm considering what is or isn't a horror movie.
Right. And that's where, like, we were talking about Silence of the Lambs. That's interesting because I think we were saying that George A. Romero has a
He does.
What do we call that?
Cameo.
A cameo. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
In the film. And so interesting to have a horror director as a cameo in your film if you are not in any way intending to elicit some kind of horror
Yeah.
response.
Yeah. It's like saying what is fun. Like fun things are different for different people.
Yeah.
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 And it's the same thing for these kind of emotions. And I think when horror is done really well, the directors tap into more fundamentally horror things because like zombies might not be horrific to everybody, but everyone, like no one wants to get stabbed viciously. So
Right.
that's
Sure.
what like slashers are very popular because it's going to be a horrific thing to everybody.
So would you argue horror is subjective then? So for example, some people watch The Exorcist and it's like the most terrifying thing they've ever seen.
Yes.
And then other people laugh through The Exorcist and they
Yes.
think
Yeah.
it's ridiculous and they don't. So does that mean for the viewer who is terrified it's a horror film and for the person who laughs through it, it's not a horror film?
I think that's where the distinction is made because it depends on what the director was trying to get across.
Right.
Whether you feel that way or not, I think that's where it changes from being a horror to not a horror.
Right.
So like we'll get into more examples, I think, specific examples, because that's just my definition of what it means to me.
Yeah, for sure.
But my view, I feel, is a little bit different. I had a little bit of an epiphany over COVID with the movies
Okay.
I was watching. I watch a lot of movies, like
You do. I think you watch more than we do.
I watch too many movies. Probably. Like I think this year, just from 2023, I watched I think the last count was like 160 movies just from 2023.
Wow.
I watched a lot of stuff, and it actually increased during COVID because I had this like epiphany about movies I watch and how I approach them. Instead of just watching a movie and watch movies that I want to see, I started watching a lot of stuff that I didn't care about or didn't necessarily want to watch or spend my time on. And I tried to like adjust my thinking process and be more subjective in what I was watching. And it was really stupid because it actually happened because of the Sonic movie.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
I know that's ridiculous.
Is that because you didn't want to see it and then you watched it and you liked it?
Yeah, that, but also when
I've heard good things about that movie, actually. I've not seen it, but
and it's not a horror movie, but like when it came out or when it was being talked about in the media stuff, they had a terrible model for him originally, and then they fixed it, and I was mad. And I'm a almost 40-year-old man being mad at a Sonic movie being released.
Don't mess with my Sonic
And
movie.
we're sitting at home with my family during COVID, and my kids are super excited about this. I'm like, why am I so upset about this stupid Sonic movie? Right? And so I'm like, this movie's not made for, I realized as, again, an almost 40-year-old man, this movie's not made for me. That's fine. So I'm going to go in and enjoy it and try and be in the same perspective or have the same perspective my children have watching it. And after I did that, and I loved the movie, even though I didn't care about it, I started going back and rewatching stuff that maybe I didn't like through that lens. Like, this wasn't made for me. I know that, and I'm going to enjoy it from like a kid's perspective, maybe someone older's perspective. There was a movie that came out. I think it was a George Romero movie, The Carnival. Did you guys see that?
Oh, that was one of his earlier, like they released it after he died. Yes.
So watching that through the lens of like someone that's in their 60s or 70s or 80s, maybe that's being taken care of by their family or whatever, it was pretty terrifying.
I heard it was good.
You know, and I tried to do that. Like, okay, how would this movie feel like if you were watching it as like an 80-year-old? It was, you know.
That's a great point. There's lots of films that I poo-pooed, but now when I watch them with my kids and I see how they're enjoying it, I'm like, oh yeah, okay, I see how like the first Star Wars movie, which like Phantom Menace, pissed me off because I'm like, this is so hard to watch.
But it wasn't made for you.
Exactly. And my kids love it. Like, okay, I can see. Or the new Hobbit movies, which I thought, they're not as good as Lord of the Rings, but then my kids can appreciate so much more. They're not scared. So that's a good point.
When I say like the semantic intent and the horror elements in movies and how it becomes horror, I try and view it when I watch horror movies now as opposed to like 5 years ago. When I'm watching a religious horror, I try and get in that mindset. Like, how would like a Christian feel about this? How would a Jewish person feel about this? And like a really good example for me is The Descent. Have you guys seen The Descent?
Yeah, the spelunking.
So before anything happens in the second part of that movie, the cave stuff is terrifying.
Me too. I find it too.
That movie is terrifying. And if you didn't have some kind of mild claustrophobia or something like that, it maybe would just be like, why are they keeping it? Like, I don't understand how this is a horror movie. But so that's a good example for me if someone else might happen to be in my shoes. Like, what would someone with claustrophobia be like watching?
Yeah.
That's
so
great.
I think intent is really important with that kind of thing because they're trying to target those audiences. And now that I can try and be in that position more, like, it's made me a bit more subjective about those kinds of things.
I think that's, coming back to The Exorcist or Jaws, like I've said this to Mike, my older son, I recommended Jaws to him and he kind of like, what are you talking? That's horrible. I'm like, I was 10 when I saw it the first time. So that sticks with me. But as an adult, also the parenting part sticks with me, that when the people on the beach and you're trying to get your kids in from the water, like I had a visceral response to that as a parent. It's like, how terrifying would that be to be so out of control in a place where you thought it was just fun and games.
Yep.
And the same with Exorcist. Like I didn't grow up religious, but I've always thought about religion and I respect, people's beliefs or whatever. And I thought the same kind of thing is like, wow, if you really believed this was true, it would be absolutely terrifying. And I think the era that a film comes out in as well, and what the audience's expectations, like I really like Evolution of Horror, and they just had a home invasion season, the podcast Evolution of Horror. And they had some older films, and one was A Lady in the Cage, which is like 1964, 62. It has a really young James Caan in it as a hoodlum. And the premise is this woman is kind of got a hip issue, and she's got an elevator in her house, but the power goes out and she's stuck in this elevator, and then there's a home invasion element. And parts of it are pretty cheesy, 1960s. But again, I was thinking, okay, if this was 1964 and that whole, hangover of conformity from the 50s, and then I'm watching this on the screen in 1954, it would be quite upsetting and terrifying, right? So I think there's that element too. We've talked about this a few times. Like, okay, as a modern audience, it doesn't have the gore or whatever that you might be used to, but take it from a filmmaker's perspective or take it from an audience's perspective. How would it have been received at the time, right?
For sure.
And
And
that
sorry.
That was the intent at the time.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
The intent in that time period was to make people afraid because of this.
Exactly.
Feel those-
Yeah.
And it's relative to what you've been exposed to before.
Yeah.
So for a little kid, going into the basement in the dark is super terrifying.
Yeah.
'Cause they've never done it before. We're an adult, they don't think twice. Like, oh, I want my beer from the basement.
Yeah, totally.
I don't care if it's dark. It's kind of like, once you've watched Terrifier 2 and then you go back and try and watch, a horror movie from the 60s, it may not land quite the same way.
And
Yeah,
I
go
think
ahead.
the difference between good horror and bad horror is when you can go back into that context, depending on the age, year, etc. And those lines start to blur. Like, I know this might be controversial, but like Psycho was on a lot of lists of like one of the best horror movies ever.
For sure.
But it's not really scary anymore. And I think it's because of the visceral elements of it. Like there's like cross-dressing, multiple
Mhm.
personalities. That's not shocking anymore. There's violence in it.
Yeah.
But I would argue an earlier movie, Night of the Hunter,
Mm.
is more scary and a better horror movie. And I mean, it's still on like a lot of lists of people's favorite
Yeah.
movies. But there's elements in that movie, like loss of children, religious manipulation.
Like themes that are more relevant.
They're still relevant, and I think that lends itself to like I think that's a better example of a horror movie, or like it's just a better movie.
Yeah.
Because the director made those choices, like the elements they chose were more relevant over a long period of time.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
Psycho might not be scary now, but when I watched Night of the Hunter like a year ago for the first time, I was like, "Wow, this is actually kind of like it's like a father with two kids. This movie's terrifying. It's scary. Like there's
Yeah.
still elements that are like, ugh."
So for the record, you're saying Psycho's a bad movie, just for our audience?
Still
Yeah.
a great movie.
Okay.
Night of the Hunter, it's higher on my list.
What was your email again that listeners can send? Hey, let me throw this in here. I'm not trying to get us off topic, but I don't know if you came across this. Looper has a list of perfect horror films.
Okay, I know
you
they
see
do all
it?
those lists. I don't know if I saw that one.
I don't
So-
think I saw that one.
This is their list, and I'm going to throw it in there just for discussion. Hereditary,
Yeah,
Agreed.
It Follows,
Agree.
Rosemary's Baby,
Agree.
Babadook,
agree.
Yeah.
Drag Me to Hell.
Oh, interesting. I love that movie.
That I thought that was interesting.
Comedy as a
Comedy horror.
Okay, I can.
Yeah, I can see that.
So their argument was that
Sam
there was
Raimi.
enough, because that's Sam Raimi,
Yeah,
right?
Sam
And
Raimi,
that there
yeah.
was enough horror elements to make it a horror.
it operates
film.
like Evil Dead.
Totally.
Like, it's
Totally.
goofy, but
Yeah. Alien,
Yep.
which is interesting because this was spinning in my mind when you mentioned Terminator. It's like I see Alien as a horror film, but not Terminator,
Mm.
and they operate on very similar levels, right? Elm Street,
Yep.
Yeah.
The Fly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess.
That one doesn't grab
I
me
mean, that's
immediately
a-
as much as some of the other
it's an
ones, but
amazing
I'd have
movie.
to go watch it again through that
Yeah, I would
lens.
too.
Silence of the Lambs.
Ha, there we go.
So there you go.
I said horror. Just for
Yeah,
the
you
record.
did. Carrie, the original, not the remake.
Oh, yeah.
Halloween
Yeah, for sure.
and The Orphanage, which I think we've watched. It's Spanish language
that's
film
nice.
about a woman who buys an old orphanage, and then there's all the ghosts. I think we've seen it.
yeah.
I've seen it for
Yeah,
sure.
I've seen it.
Oh, I haven't
Troll
seen
2 wasn't on the list?
No,
Oh.
and Winnie the Pooh didn't show up, but I think they're updating the list at some point.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, I can
yeah.
Wait for the sequel.
Anyway, I just thought I'd throw that in there because I mean, obviously they had rationale for each one why they were, perfect horror films. But the Drag Me to Hell one,
That's
I've seen quite a few times.
Exorcist wasn't on that list?
No.
Oh.
That's. I think we'll get to that later, but
So do you agree with Aaron's definition largely of horror? Do you disagree in any way? Or is there anything you would add to it?
No, I mean, it's a great definition, and I really like the distinction that you made, Aaron, about intent versus impact. Let's call it that.
Yeah.
So your your impact or your reaction as a viewer can be separate from the intent of the filmmaker,
Absolutely.
right? And I mean, as an English teacher, I talked about this in literature. It doesn't, yes, it's good to have context, but it doesn't really matter. And this was my stance in literature. An author can say, I intended this, but how did you receive it?
Mhm.
As like, it can be distinct from what was intended versus what was accepted by the viewer, reader, whatever it is. So yeah, I really like that. I mean, I think that's been, and I like your distinction about trying to put yourself in the mindset, because I do like older horror films, which may not be horror by modern standards,
Yeah.
but I look at, like, I really like Cat People from 1942.
Cats? You like cats?
No,
Oh.
I don't like cats. I do like some cats, but I prefer dogs. I'm a dog
I've been to
person.
musical.
Oh, the musical. Okay.
That's a horror movie.
That is pretty horrific. Some of those costumes are. Yeah, I feel like I really like Cat People because I love it's not horrific in a modern sense, but I think about 1942. What's this like? What's Val Lewton doing with this movie? What about the light and the shadow? What about like that would be scary
Yeah.
for some people, right?
And it's almost a time machine too. Like
Yeah, 100%.
horror for me, one of the reasons I like the horror genre so much is that I think it's a little bit more honest than other forms of filmmaking or other genres of filmmaking, where like even using Psycho as an example again, it was the first movie to have a toilet in it.
Mhm.
Like there wasn't any drama or comedy at the time that would have been able to get away with that.
Or Night of the Living Dead having like a black lead and a female lead.
Yeah.
Like that was not done before, and that
But
was
you
the
were allowed
horror
to do it in a
genre.
horror movie because
Yeah.
horror movies start off as like an edgy thing. So
Yeah,
when you
yeah.
go back and watch a really good horror movie, it's like it's a bit more honest. Like if you go back and watch Gone with the Wind, it's hard to kind of gauge a little bit
Yeah.
what's going on in society. But if you go back and watch some of the horror stuff, it's like, oh, is this how people were actually feeling back then, as opposed to the more popular movies of the time?
Because they do kind of reflect whatever is societal anxieties.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, yeah. So I want to add a wrinkle to this. I was doing the dishes the other day thinking about this topic, and this came to me. So I think the thing that makes horror especially difficult is that there's horror content and there's horror the mood, which is unique in film genres. So if I said to you, what makes a Western film a Western? Well, we've got cowboys, we've got shootouts, we've got saloons, we've got horses, we've got deserts. So a Western film is sort of defined by the content in the film. Same with sci-fi is largely defined by the content in the film. So is there spaceships? Is there aliens? Is
Yeah.
there futuristic technology? And so there's other genres though where there's comedy, and there's nothing about the content. Comedy is a mood. Romance is a mood. Thriller is a mood. But there's no inherent content for a comedy. You could take any content and make it into
Yeah.
a comedy.
Yeah.
But with horror, you have both. So on the one hand, you have horror content. We have zombies, we have werewolves, we have vampires, we have ghosts, we have witches. Those things we associate with horror. And I think people are tempted to anything with a werewolf or a
Yeah.
zombie or a vampire is sort of lumped in with horror because those things are associated with the horror genre. But on the other hand, there's horror, the mode, where, as to Aaron's definition, about trying to elicit fear and repulsion and disgust. And I feel like horror might be the only genre that has both elements, where it's both a mood but also contains content. And that's why there's horror comedies
Yeah.
and there's horror romance.
Yeah.
You might have a romance film about a vampire, and so is that
Yes.
horror? Or you might have comedies with zombies. Is that horror? And I feel like you don't have that problem with other genres because there's no Western mood necessarily, other than like wow wow wow.
Yeah.
Or there's
Yeah,
no like I can't whistle very good. So I wonder if horror is a little bit unique, and that there's things that we consider horror content, and that can lead it to bleed into other genres, but then it also operates as a mode. So there's a lot of things that could consider a film horror.
I think that's a really good point and distinction to make. And my favorite example of it is romance versus horror, where things that are romantic now, if you go back to like the 60s and 70s romance movies, people that they have to like take parts of these movies out when they put them on new streaming services because people will be offended by it.
Right.
Like there's
Right.
a very famous I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but a John Wayne movie where like the penultimate scene is that he throws his woman into like a fountain and spanks her for being bad.
Yes.
And and this was like a love story Western back in the day, but that is just completely not acceptable anymore. But if you go back and watch Psycho and someone gets stabbed to death, that's always horror. Like a romance movie, romance is going to change with the times a little bit, and you go back, it's like, oh, that's not very romantic or like unacceptable. But a stabbing is always a stabbing, and it's always a visceral feeling. Like you're not
Yes.
going to go back and watch that woman get thrown like physically abused and be like, oh, this is so cute.
Right.
For sure.
He must love her.
But the stabbing is always a stabbing.
But that's tricky too, right? Because there's like body horror, which we often will take films with horrific body horror, consider it horror. But then you have a film like Saving Private Ryan, which has like over the top,
Yes.
brutal gore, but you would never call it a horror
Exactly.
film. Even though being a soldier in World War II and storming the
Yes.
beaches of Normandy would be a horrific experience. So that's really tricky
Yeah.
too. Is when does it cross a line from it's a horrific experience for this person encountering it, but then when does it become a horror film?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think I have. So I'm going to bring an example in because we've mentioned one of these films. So one of the examples for me, we talked about this in our Silence of the Lambs episode. I don't consider Silence of the Lambs horror, although there are horror elements in it, but I consider Seven a horror film. And for me, the difference is the tone and mood of Seven versus Silence of the Lambs, which I argue operates as a procedural for the majority of the film with horrific elements and a nod to serial killers and this and that and the other thing. Whereas Seven, although very similar, you've got a serial killer, but it's religious based, and you've got horrific scenes, just like those dark, grimy scenes like you do in the basement in Silence of the Lambs. You have that in Seven, but it's the mood and it's the approach to the topic that I think puts it over the top into the horror genre as opposed to non. So so you said Silence of the Lambs was horror.
Yeah, so my response to that, have you seen Manhunter?
Yes.
So that's the Hannibal Lecter story.
Yes.
So I was actually listening to the first episode of Evolution of Horror.
Okay.
And they brought on a guy to discuss. And he says if you compare Silence of the Lambs to Manhunter, that Silence of the Lambs appears to be kind of like lit, shot, and scored like a horror film, whereas Manhunter is more
Agreed.
a procedural thriller.
Yeah.
So it kind of... So I guess he was using the example of like Hannibal Lecter is just like a white padded room in Manhunter.
Yeah.
But then in Silence of the Lambs, he's in this like dark, dingy
Yeah.
cage.
Very gothic.
Yeah, exactly. And the cinematography and the way the score is utilized makes it feel like a horror film. So on a spectrum, I guess you would have like Manhunter, not a horror film, Seven
Right.
for sure a horror film, and this is why everyone struggles with Silence of the Lambs. But I would say it is is it shot in a way that elicits horror?
So that comes back to Aaron's idea of intent, right?
Yeah.
So did Jonathan Demme intend that to be a horror film? And therefore, do we just accept the director's intent, or what's our subjective experience of that?
Or was that not his intention? And
Yeah.
he just was not good at directing it that way.
Yeah, to your point.
Like, I mean, that could
Yeah, totally. Yeah,
to be fair, Silence of the Lambs is a great movie.
yeah,
I
absolutely.
love it.
It's on the list of perfect horror films.
Yeah. Yeah. Still, that intent never came across to me. There's
Yeah.
too many other elements. The focus is more on the investigation, it felt like, than the actual. There's no focus on the elements.
Yeah.
So it doesn't feel like, even if the score and the lighting and stuff, the intent with that was to make it foreboding or whatever, the overall intent and focus of the movie didn't seem like it was the horror elements.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I had this conversation with my parents a few weeks ago just to kind of test it out. And my dad's like, yeah, no, Silence of the Lambs not a horror film. Like it's and my mom was like, it is 100% a horror film. She's like, I had to leave the theater. I was so terrified. She's like, if you are a woman and you are watching Silence of the Lambs, it's a horror film. So it's just interesting how this one really...
Yeah, and I read something recently about, because I hadn't really considered. We talked about that in the episode where we reviewed it, but the idea of looking at Silence of the Lambs as they didn't use the word horror, but from a gender perspective of Jodie Foster's character being in a man's world and how she is controlled and manipulated by not only Hannibal Lecter, but by her superiors at the FBI.
Mhm.
And that scene, they do, it wouldn't be a crane shot, but there's a scene where they really emphasize there's a scene with the autopsy where they find the first girl, Bimmel, I think is her name, and they're with all the state troopers, and they pull up so that you can kind of see the room with all these big, 6 foot something troopers, and then Jodie Foster's character, and that's, I think that the gist of what I read was that that's a menacing film if you're a woman.
Yeah.
Because it's not just the killers that are menacing, but it's the men around you.
Yeah. To that point, I think that's a huge part of the theme of that movie, especially in like the first half.
Yeah.
Because they focus on that a lot, even in that autopsy scene. There's men in the room that are getting sick and then they don't want the smell and all that stuff. And she's kind of just doing her job.
Yeah.
I mean, even when I think it's the first time she goes to interview Hannibal Lecter, where the guy in the cell
Yes.
bodily fluids at her.
Yeah.
And she's kind of unfazed by it and just goes about her thing.
Yeah.
It's giving her strength in the movie. And I think like it's fairly obvious the intent they're going for there. And I think that's what they focus on so much that it didn't feel like horror to me.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, they're making this strong female character like really stand out as that. Like the training parts at the beginning and all that, like the running,
Absolutely.
doing very masculine things and sloughing off and being stronger than all the males in different scenes and stuff. So I think partly that's why I don't think it's a horror movie, because that there's so much focus on those elements.
Yeah.
And there is, again, there's a foreboding in the lighting and the sound and all that stuff. But
then the scene with the
convinced you?
security guards in the cage, like that really feels like horror.
Absolutely.
When he's biting his face and like the look of horror and the I think they hang the security guard when they walk in.
Yeah, it's a brutal scene. There's no doubt.
to me, scenes like that are more trying to paint a better picture, like a very dark, strong picture of who he is as a person, so that you maybe like you feel like you want him to be caught. Maybe as before he was being so helpful and stuff, he was like, oh, he's being like, I mean, give him a nicer cell.
Yeah, they kind of reveal the reality.
Of the situation
Yeah.
and how strong this person is and whatnot. So
Do you think part of it is the director too, because of the reputation of horror? That if you wanted to make a horror film and you made a horror film, you're kind of poo-pooed by Hollywood, or So I feel like almost he wanted to make a horror film, but just enough that he could still, win Academy Awards and be accepted by the mainstream, but kind of knock on that horror door. I wonder if that was part of it too.
It does get butts and seats.
Yeah.
It does.
And it just doesn't, like the horror genre doesn't get much respect, especially at that time, got even less respect. So maybe he kind of wanted to make a horror film, but not so much that, he would end up getting lumped in with the
And I don't recall,
degenerates.
and I think my reading is it was never marketed as a horror film for exactly that reason, because you want that serial killer procedural thriller that brings in audiences. Whereas I think when you say this is a horror film, you've immediately, halved your audience, or maybe less, because people say, oh, I don't like horror films, and they just have a reaction.
And do you find this in your real life? Like when I tell people on the street, like I like horror films, I know they are making assumptions about the types of films that I'm watching, which isn't correct. Like they assume I'm only watching like Freddy, Jason, and Michael Myers, even though I think there is such a breadth of content within the horror genre. But in their mind, I just like blood and guts and slashers and
and I think I've said this on episodes before. I actually don't engage often in conversations like when we did the Jay of the Dead episode.
You will now wearing the shirt around town.
Yeah, exactly. We did the Jay of the Dead episode, and I was giving blood that day, and the nurse said to me, "Oh, making small talk or whatever," and I didn't want to tell her what movie we were doing, because we were doing
Anna Fritz.
Anna Fritz, the corpse of Anna Fritz.
I'm watching a necrophilia movie.
Yeah, and I was like, "Oh, well, we're just doing this movie. It's kind of obscure, But exactly that. I mean, I think people make assumptions, and I really like black and white as a genre, but I think about like Eyes Without a Face, French film. Like that was so good. Carnival of Souls, which is I think 67 or 68. I felt like a really good film. And those aren't traditional horror films. And I think that's what keeps me coming back. Mike and I have talked many times about Evolution of Horror, the podcast. Although there are things that I have niggles about, I'm introduced to so many films that I wouldn't consider horror, but I say to myself, oh, maybe I should give that a watch. Like I'd never watch, Lady in a Cage if he hadn't introduced me to it. But it gives me context and perspective and all those kinds of things, right? So
Aaron, or like, what's our take on horror comedy then? Like, are there films that are horror comedies we would consider horror? Or in your mind, can a horror comedy not be a horror?
No, they absolutely can, but I think it comes down to intent and focus. It depends, like how much time they're giving those elements.
Yeah.
Zombieland came up in
Yeah.
and I said not a horror because I mean there's zombies in the movie, but how much is it the focus? It's more of like the background to put this comedy on. So I mean you could. It's probably listed as that because it has horror elements in it, and if they didn't, then kids were going to the theater and people.
What's the Simon Pegg one?
That
Shaun of the Dead?
Shaun of the Dead,
yeah.
of course, yeah. Like
Those
that
are
one
the ones
starts
I
in
haven't-
comedy, but by the end actually feels more like a traditional horror movie.
And there's more visceral horror elements in
Yeah.
that, like loss of family and like coming to grips with like not being in touch with your friends and stuff anymore. Things that are like kind of more visceral.
Mhm.
It's the same zombie backdrop, but the elements that they focus on are a little bit more kind of deep down, more
Right.
visceral.
So for you, horror content is sort of irrelevant. It's not about whether a vampire is in it or a werewolf is in it. For you, it's what was the intent of the director and the mode of the film?
Yeah, and I think smart directors kind of have a much better balance. Like you can kind of tell the skill level based on how much focus and things go either way. And sometimes people just put stuff in the movies so that again they can just get butts and seats. Like
Mhm.
Yeah.
they call it a horror movie, and it's very obviously not a horror movie. Just so they put like a zombie in it so they can get the tag and to get people in and get that niche audience.
Yeah, like I mean, if you think of Universal movies and the monster movies, and then with all the Abbott and Costello films, those are straight up comedy films, despite the fact they have a werewolf or a whatever.
Absolutely.
And I think Sam Raimi is a good example. Like I think Evil Dead is a horror film, and it's scary in some moments, but there's those moments of levity and comedy. And I think just like Shakespeare,
Barbarian.
yeah. And Drag Me to Hell, horror movie in my mind all the way. But you have these elements where a good director, a talented director will know how much tension can I bring up and when do I need to release it so that I can build it again, right? I mean, and I come back to Shakespeare on this. Like in his tragedies, you build tension. You can't maintain tension for 90 minutes or 2
For sure,
hours.
yeah.
You have to know when to release it. And I think good horror comedies, more horror films, they know that comedy is an element to release tension and then build it up again for your audience.
But
Right?
there's films like Sinister, which are super dark and super
Yes.
horror. But there's moments of comedy
Yeah, there are. Yeah.
for that break of tension. And
Yeah.
then there's movies like Zombieland, which it does break the tension, but clearly they're trying to have
Yeah.
a mode of comedy as well. So for you, is it just about the ratio?
I think so. I think that's what.
So it's
Dracula
almost
Dead and
flipped,
Loving
right?
It would be too much comedy.
Yeah.
Yeah, to your point about releasing the tension. So Zombieland, instead of releasing the horror tension with a joke, they almost do it the other way. They release
That's
a
right.
comedy with a
Yes.
horror.
Some
element.
horror,
Yeah.
yeah.
So it's like they've been making jokes and living in this mansion for 20 minutes or whatever, and then they shoot Bill Murray.
Yeah. Totally.
It's the exact flip of what
Yes.
you would expect from the opposite of the genre.
Yeah.
So instead of releasing the tension with one thing, they're releasing it with the other.
And I
That's
think
what it flips it and makes it not a horror movie. To
they
me.
set up that film in my mind as not a horror movie with the opening scene with him in the parking lot being chased by zombies and the overlays about you've got 10 seconds to do this, and that to me signals to the audience this is not a horror film. This is
So
a comedy.
Totally Killer or Freaky, they're like slasher. It's like a
Yeah.
slasher formula, but done in a comedic way. Would you call those horror films?
Those
Totally Killer, no.
Okay.
But Freaky, I did think went a little bit darker. It's kind of like the Seven idea. There was a
Right.
darkness there, like a dark underbelly, whereas I didn't feel that in Totally Killer.
So Totally Killer, I think, is a very new phenomenon, and it's really interesting, a completely new discussion, because I think that might have been an AI written movie.
Oh, no way.
I
That's
didn't know
cool.
that.
And it's like, well, just think of all the horror like, okay, you take horror and comedy, stick it into an AI engine, and spit a movie out. That's why maybe it didn't really flow for me. It didn't feel
Oh, I didn't
like a
realize that. That's
complete
super
movie.
interesting.
And so if you rewatch it with that lens,
Yeah, I will have
so
to do that.
that becomes its own. That's a whole another discussion.
Yeah.
I really,
Leslie Vernon, would we consider that a horror film?
Leslie, I don't think of.
It's like a mockumentary about a slasher.
Oh, I haven't seen that.
Oh, it's so you gotta
It's
watch
so
Leslie
good.
Vernon.
Yeah. I mean, I put it off for so long and then I watched it and I was like, wow, this is really good. So, okay, Leslie Vernon is a really interesting
It
one
is.
because it's like Scream because it's so self-referential.
Yes.
It's sending up all the horror elements. And this is why it's so like I know I'm going to contradict myself because I think Scream is a horror film.
Yeah.
Leslie Vernon, oh man, I'll go out on a limb and say no, it's not.
You guys both are so excited.
Email us at dudesthedead@gmail.com.
Leslie Vernon. I'm gonna have to watch that.
Yeah,
It's
Leslie
so
Vernon.
good.
So it's like a mockumentary through the perspective of the slasher. So you're following him around. He's like talking about like, oh yeah, like you got so exhausting. You gotta like chase these teenagers around, and you gotta like go fast, but make it look like you're still walking and not running. Like
that
it's just
sounds
kind of
right
this
up my alley.
funny satire about slasher films. But I would say it's operating as a comedy, kind of. But it's a tough one.
Yeah,
I bring it up
that's
for
a really
that.
difficult one.
Yeah.
Well, so while we're talking about not horrors, I think I agree with most of this list, but a couple of ones we've talked about. So these are not horror films that some people label as horror.
Is this a Looper list or?
No, it's not Looper. It's a
Okay.
different list. Clockwork Orange, which I would tend to agree with.
Yeah.
Is not horror?
Not horror. These are all not horror films. Nocturnal Animals,
Not seen it.
which is
That's
really good film.
Jake Gyllenhaal?
But yeah. The Revenant.
No.
Trying to remember what that one is.
That's Leo
DiCaprio.
DiCaprio. There's
Oh,
a
the bear one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've not seen that. It's been on my list
not-
forever.
Oh, how-
I agree
yeah.
with that.
I know.
No Country for Old Men.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't call that.
Blue Velvet.
Okay, see that one walks the line.
Yeah.
I could see not horror. But
Nightcrawler.
would you say Lost Highway? Like some of them are maybe more
It's-
horror.
So those are David Lynch movies.
Late
right?
Lynch, yeah,
That's because you never know what his intent is. Like,
Totally.
yeah,
Yeah.
and they all have horror elements,
yes,
including
and they have the vibe, they have the sound, they have
Yeah.
yes,
lighting,
like they're shot
they
like horror
feel-
films
yes,
almost.
Yeah.
Yes.
Nightcrawler. That's a Jake Gyllenhaal one as
Oh,
well.
yeah,
Oh
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I
One of
don't
the
think
most
that's.
underrated movies of the last
I
year.
wouldn't call that a horror.
I wouldn't call
Yeah,
it.
me neither. Killing of a Sacred Deer.
Those ones are interesting. A lot of his movies are very borderline. That one maybe I would actually call a horror movie
Interesting.
because I think that was. There's a lot of it. That movie is just about intent. The entire thing with the way that dialogue is delivered and stuff. And have you guys seen that?
I've
Yes,
seen it. Yeah.
it walks that
Every
line
part
too.
of that movie is very, very intentional.
Yeah.
To make you feel uneasy.
Yeah,
and
very uncomfortable. Yeah.
So, but
I think I saw it in a horror list too. That's what prompted me to
Yeah.
watch it.
Interesting how many Jake Gyllenhaal movies
I
are
know,
on this
yeah.
one.
Donnie Darko we brought up too.
Yeah, Prisoners, another Jake
No,
Gyllenhaal.
Mm-hmm.
awesome movie.
Jake Gyllenhaal's whole career just walking the line
Yeah.
between horror, not horror.
See, I don't think fantastic film. I don't
Yeah.
think that's horror.
No,
No,
Pan's Labyrinth.
yeah,
that's a.
I think
my
that
kid
one
about
might be.
children's horror. It could be a horror movie for kids. I don't know.
There are definitely some scary scenes.
Yeah.
in that
Benicio
one.
del Toro, a lot of
That's
his stuff.
again. That's the same thing as David Lynch. It's Benicio del Toro, or not
Yeah.
Benicio del Toro.
Yeah.
Guillermo del Toro.
Oh, Guillermo del
Guillermo
Toro.
del- yeah.
Sorry, yeah.
His movies have a vibe. They have
Yeah.
they have a weird,
Yeah.
you know. It's so that's hard to pin down.
Actually, so that. Oh no, do you have more you want to go through?
Just yeah, there's three more
Sure.
left on the list. Angel Heart.
Not seen it.
Not seen that.
Really?
Yeah.
How could you not see that? I actually have the novel, which I haven't read.
What era is that?
That's
Like the 80s.
80s.
Okay.
That's not David
It's-
Lynch movie, is it?
No, I don't think it's David Lynch.
That's Wild
it's,
at Heart.
Yeah, Wild
Oh,
at
right,
Heart.
right.
Nicolas
no,
Cage.
Angel Heart is with Lisa Bonet and Robert De Niro
Oh, not
as
seen
Robert De Niro as the devil.
it. Oh, like Devil's Advocate.
Yeah,
Al
but
Pacino.
but it takes place in New Orleans.
Hmm.
And what's his name? Mickey Rourke.
Oh, okay.
Before all the punches and plastic surgery.
He's
where
actually a
he-
really good actor. I like him.
so yeah, you got to see that one. And
Okay, yeah, I'll
see,
put it
I don't
on
know.
the
I mean,
list.
for me, it still holds up, especially De Niro. He's so good, but the premise is super interesting. Like it takes you. You might figure it out sooner, but the first time I saw it, it was like, what? So I would recommend it. Anyway,
Cool.
Zodiac. Jake
Yeah, those-
Gyllenhaal.
That's a tough one.
That is. Those serial killer ones are.
I know,
are tough.
right?
Serial killer movies are
Because there's the crime genre,
a
but
very thin
yeah.
line.
yeah.
And the last one, which I think is super interesting, is Under the Skin.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Another
I would. Yes, I would.
a
say
very
that's
dry
horror.
movie. It's hard to say what the intent was, but again, I could.
Yeah,
That one's tough.
That's a
I'd
Scarlett
have to think about
Johansson.
it.
yeah,
Yeah,
Yeah. I'd have to
that
think
one's
about
cool.
that.
I think that's horror.
because I think the intent is horror.
Me too.
Yeah.
It's not
Yeah,
that
such an
horror drama.
interesting film, and I think underrated and underwatched film.
So it almost just seems like there's a spectrum,
Yeah.
and it's like clearly horror, clearly not horror, and it's those
What's in
ones
the
kind of
middle?
in the
Yeah.
middle, and how many horror elements and
It's-
what is the ratio?
It's whether it's horror or horrific. Something can, like, again, it's,
Yeah,
it's,
I
it's
agree.
semantic intent. It's what the intention of the elements are, like, directed at the audience, and then whether you feel horror or not is, or feel horrific or not is.
Is there subjectivity though? Is it fair to say that for someone it is a horror movie, for someone it's not?
Yeah, I was just going to ask the same. Are there
Well,
films that are 100%
Like
horror?
for my
no
mom,
matter
Silence
what?
of the Lambs is a horror film.
Yeah.
For my dad, it's not.
So,
Is one of them right, one of them wrong, or is there room for subjectivity?
from my perspective, because I grew up in such a very stringent religious household, I mean, Jurassic Park would have probably been a horror movie. There's a lot of movies when you have like a certain set of moral standards that are just there's gonna be like everything's gonna be horror.
Yeah,
at a point.
yeah.
Like I know like some older people in my family, they don't watch anything that's rated over PG, and they like Psycho is absolutely unwatchable.
Oh, Stuckman did a whole video on that.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned it. Me and him have very similar upbringings.
Yeah, I remember you saying that. Yeah.
So like a lot of stuff would say like Terminator would absolutely be a horror movie.
Right.
Jurassic Park would absolutely be a horror movie. The Matrix. I remember that was a huge big deal
Wow.
when I was a kid. The Matrix was you do not go see that movie
Yeah.
because it's very it's scary what the future could hold and all this stuff.
Oh, interesting.
So when you realize that those extremes are out there, that's kind of where it makes me say that it's the intent of the director, and they're the ones drawing the line. Because if you let the public draw the line, then like the movie Dogma, like that's
Right.
not
Oh, yeah.
that's not a horror movie, right?
Bloody Christ.
But absolutely, people thought that was like a
Yeah.
horrific movie.
What's your take on Jurassic Park quickly? Because if we were saying well, there's those kind of creature feature movies too, right? Which are
Yeah.
if you have a creature that's hunting and killing people, like Jaws or like Lake Placid, or there's any number of them. Like in my mind, I'm trying to figure out what makes
Piranha.
Piranha. Oh yeah, Piranha.
Anaconda.
Yeah, so like Jurassic Park's sort of like a family movie, I guess, but but it really is giant creatures eating and killing people off, and there's a few survivors left at the end. So like, what is the difference between a Jaws and a Jurassic Park, and do you think there's any intent there?
Such a good question.
You have giant T-Rex dinosaurs, and it's kind of it's suspenseful.
Oh, for
it's
sure.
tense.
Yeah.
They're eating people. They're running and hiding and screaming, and they're terrified of like velociraptors. So I don't know how we could say that Jaws is a horror film and not say Jurassic Park is a horror film, but they do feel different somehow.
Yeah, I think it's the director's intent and the elements they use to show that, like the music in Jurassic Park, even the chase scenes and stuff. Is
Yeah.
kind of not whimsical, but it's
Well, same director, I guess.
it's adventure driven. Like, and then Jaws is more like jump scares, punchy
Yeah.
sounds.
Yeah.
you
Because
know.
Spielberg flirts with horror quite a
Yeah,
bit.
Yeah, and I would say, like, I guess for me, because I was thinking about this when you asked about Jurassic Park, and it's like, yeah, but I think Jaws is but I think there are some elements that are very different. Music's one of them. The anthropomorphizing of the shark as evil, as having intent to do something.
Those velociraptors are evil.
But I don't see them being
They're just natural hunters.
portrayed that way. Yeah, exactly. I think it comes back to intent and how's the movie operating. Because it seemed to me in Jaws, you've got the element of the unknown because you've got the depths of the ocean, right? And you've also got this smart, evil, intent on destruction
Yeah.
thing.
yeah. The creature of that movie is absolutely just murdering.
Yeah, yeah.
It's not baser instinct hunting for food. It's destroying boats and
Yeah. So to me, that seems like the line that's crossed is that idea that although a T-Rex is terrifying if you were to meet one, and I think when I remember seeing that in theaters, and there were some scary scenes, like that T-Rex scene is quite
Yeah, I feel
scary.
like they're shot like horror.
Yeah, I just but
I think
There's
Yeah.
a suspense, and they're holding on. They
manipulation
look terrified, and you
intent,
like see
Yeah.
it coming through the dark, and the way it's shot, and the suspense. Yeah, it's interesting.
so what's coming back to that though? What's your distinction that you asked about with child horror? Because I see that as well.
Yes. So here's a list of films: The Burbs, Goosebumps, Hocus Pocus, Nightmare Before Christmas, Gremlins. I think they have the intent, like you were saying, but I think the intent is to scare children.
Right.
So, but I think they have all those horror elements, but they're just dialed down for a younger
Yeah,
audience.
I agree.
But I think their intent is horror. So if you watch the original Gremlins, you know, if you're comparing that to Halloween or something, it doesn't seem
Yeah.
scary. But for a kid watching that movie,
Totally.
and sort of with a child audience in mind, or Poltergeist maybe as
They're
well.
gateway drugs.
They are kind of gateway
Yeah,
drugs.
yeah.
Like those are the movies you watch as a kid that get you into horror.
Yeah.
But they're made at an appropriate content level for a
Yes.
younger audience. But
Yeah.
I think the intent of the director is to be horror, and it's just dialing down the elements so a child can handle it. But I do think kids horror is a thing. I think that's another reason that it's hard to characterize these horror films, because I think there's a lot of movies that seem like they wouldn't be horror because they're for kids, but really they're operating as horror films.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, and I think that's a really kind of hard genre to make, the kids horror stuff.
Mhm.
It's like Gremlins and stuff, amazing movies. Night Before Christmas, amazing movie, stuff that I would show my kids. And there was an example in 2023 where I was hoping I was gonna get my kids to watch this movie. It was called I can't remember the exact name. It was like There's
Terrifier?
Something in My Barn, or
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Did you watch that?
No, but it looks good. I saw the trailer. Actually, I meant to watch that
I was
one.
watching it and thinking, oh, this would be a great kids horror movie to watch like over the Christmas season. And then they started dropping like F-bombs everywhere.
That's too bad.
and it's like, wait a minute. So your intent was to make this kind of childish creature feature movie. So I'm thinking this is for kids, and then they throw an F-bomb. It's like, so then it's like just an unskilled director not knowing
Totally.
quite what
Yeah.
his audience
Yeah.
is. It's like, I'm not gonna like. I watched it because I watch everything, but who else is gonna watch this movie
100%.
other than me, who's just watching everything? Because I could have shown my kids, I could have recommended it to you, and you.
Yeah.
And like if you have some younger kid, like some like preteens or something, go watch this movie, and then all of a sudden there's just like half a dozen F bombs dropped.
That
in there.
is
Yeah.
unfortunate. And a movie that always gets lumped in this category too. In the 80s, did you ever watch Monster Squad?
Yes.
No.
I loved Monster Squad, but they're saying Monster Squad has that same problem where it's clearly made for kids, but it's too edgy, too dark, too scary for kids. So it kind of like appeals to nobody. So I guess you got to walk a fine line if you're going to dial down your.
Yeah, you got to rein in all the different elements,
Yeah.
not just one.
Here's one that, admittedly terrible parenting moment. My older son wanted to see Beowulf in the theaters. And I had my kids, for the weekend or whatever. So I took both of my kids. My younger son was absolutely apoplectic with terror.
Oh, wow.
And
An animated Beowulf?
How old was
yeah,
he?
the animated
4?
How old was he?
8, I
yeah.
think.
Oh,
And
take my 8-year-old.
I had to take him out. Like I had to say to my other son, "We'll meet you when the movie's over. I'm going to take him for an ice cream or something and try to, bring him down."
So I would have
from
thought
the
of that
ledge.
as more of an action film than a horror film. But is
Yeah,
it?
well,
An interesting one. 'Cause
Yeah.
that the actual theater experience of that movie was very unique at the time because of the digital animation.
Exactly.
It was very, that was like a new kind of cool thing.
it was, and that's why my older son wanted to see it. But I think there are some moments in there where things are like torn apart or whatever. Anyway, I just that just flashed into my mind. I don't think it's a horror film. I'm not trying to suggest it is, but coming back to that subjective experience, we've talked about the movies like The Exorcist and Halloween for me, which have stuck with me, and Jaws. I those were all either preteen or just barely a teen, like 12, 13. And those were the ones that still scare me, still, give me goosebumps or whatever, even after all these years.
Yeah. for
Whereas
sure.
Nightmare on Elm Street, I was in my 20s when that came out. So not so much.
Yeah.
I think that subjective experience also is where are you at in your life? Because things that are horrific as a parent, as a teen, number one, you might be thinking, I'm never getting married and I'm not going to, have kids or whatever. But as a parent, it's like, oh, like,
We've talked about that a few times.
Yeah.
Like Cargo or something. Like if you have a child,
It's terrible.
totally.
it feels way more scary than if you don't.
Or Megan, right? Like
Yeah.
your experience with Megan as a person with younger children was very different than mine, who have kids in their 20s, right? So it's quite a different experience, and what you find terrifying, particularly real life experiences, like losing a child. I remember once being absolutely, again, great parenting moment. I was in Superstore with my youngest child, and I was 100% sure he was right beside me. He was a bit of a wanderer. He might have been 5 at the time. It was like he wasn't there. And I was absolutely terrified, like running up and down the aisles.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
I mean, he was totally fine, wandered off and looked at something or whatever. But when he was really small, I used to put a bell,
I remember
like
you
a
saying that.
fishing bell, on his jerseys, and he couldn't get it off.
That's
and
next level.
I
That's
just hear
smart.
like tinkle, tinkle, tinkle. It's like,
Oh, there he is.
there he is.
That's why movies like Rosemary's Baby stuff will always be scary to me.
Yeah.
That's they're part of that like perfect horror movie thing.
Yeah.
Because the horror elements or elements that the director chose to put in those are so visceral. They're just like ingrained in
Yeah.
us as humans.
Yeah.
Like I was saying earlier, like a stabbing will always be a stabbing.
Yeah.
No one wants to get stabbed repeatedly with a knife. No one
Yeah.
wants to lose a child.
Yeah.
And that's where smart directors make that the when they want to be like a real horror movie, those lines are very sharp.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Rosemary's Baby is a good example because I only watched that a few years ago, and I was kind of thinking like, this movie's from the '60s. I don't know if it's going to hold up, and it did. It really did,
Yeah.
and that surprised me.
And
So.
I think a fun experiment to do if you don't know if something's horror or not is to try and recommend it to a variety of people. And
Oh, interesting.
like, again, I have a lot of religious family, so a lot of the movies I watch I would never recommend to them.
Terrifier 2, you wouldn't recommend?
No. and so then try and find that line of what movies you would recommend to your friends. Like
They might like Corpse of Anna Fritz.
Yeah.
I actually haven't seen that.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
House of a Thousand Corpses.
But like, there's people that I would recommend Zombieland to that I would not recommend Shaun of the Dead to.
Yeah,
And
they
they're
are
both
different.
very similar movies from a very similar era, and because of intent,
Hmm.
one might be acceptable and one might. There's still kind of a fine line if you don't like horror, but I think that's a good thing to do is try and find, would I let my kid watch this? If not, then it's probably more in the horror genre.
Yeah, it's so fun to talk about. And I just don't know if any other genre you can have this conversation.
It's incredibly difficult, and I think a lot because the film art is based off of very human things like heroes' journeys
Yeah.
and romance and those things. But like I said, romance, the idea of romance changes so much.
Totally.
So I'm trying to, if I were a listener, is there a clear line for us about what is and what isn't, or are we saying it's too hard to call?
For
Sorry.
me, I have a line because I watch so much stuff and I really like recommending movies to people. So I try and have a very stringent like kind of guideline for myself of like, oh, if it has this in it, I'm not going to recommend it. I am going to recommend it type of thing. So there is for me because of how I kind of ingest entertainment, but I don't know if everyone would need to have that fine line.
I feel like mostly it's pretty easy. Like clearly most films in the horror genre are horror, and that's an easy distinction to make. And there's many films that are not horror, but I do think there's this like 5% in every year on like the Rotten Tomatoes that there's a couple of films that you're just like it walks the line, it has horror elements. And because you were kind of talking about ratios with the comedy thing,
Yeah.
it's just like I think there is a level of subjectivity, and I think it's just tough. Like even the like Birth Rebirth, like is that a horror film?
Oh,
Well, yeah.
absolutely. I think so. That was really good too.
Yeah.
Again, that comes back because it's harkening back to the Frankenstein story. I would say that's intent. What's
Yeah.
the intent of that
Yeah.
film?
Yeah.
Now, I didn't find it horrific. I thought it was well-made film. But the intent of that was definitely horror.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you can never make a quantitative judgment like, okay, well, of its runtime, it has 52%
No,
of the
for
time
sure.
it's operating in the
For
horror
sure.
genre. Therefore, it is conclusively a horror film.
Yeah.
I think there's always just going to be that little bit of gray area, that 5% for like the Silence of the Lambs of
Yeah.
the world that are just, it's going to be subjective.
And you have to remember the monetary incentive to label things a certain
Oh, for
way as
sure.
well.
For sure.
Like, a movie that might not have been seen by anyone, if you label it horror, it might have at least
Yeah.
a little niche audience.
And where is it going to come out in
Yeah.
terms of its rating?
Yeah.
Right. If you're going to label something with an R and it's horror, you're going to get probably a hardcore audience. Whereas
Yeah.
if it's PG and horror, you're looking for that teen audience or 17, whatever.
And do you feel that over time, horror elements have been creeping into other genres more often? Like, I feel like maybe in the 80s, it was more clear whether something was horror or not horror. But it seems like in the last decade or so, I don't know if you have more horror directors or it's more socially acceptable, but it just seems like there's more films that are harder to categorize that are like, there's a lot more horror elements in romance or drama or comedy. I don't know if that's a newer thing or maybe I just haven't watched enough or I don't know. What do you think?
I feel like it's a bit of a newer thing because I do feel like because of the the relegation to horror films kind of as a B genre for a long time.
Mhm.
It wasn't until, like, I would argue, yes, there were good horror films in all of those decades, but I would argue the 70s is when that transition started to happen from kind of like the grindhouse B films into, you know, The Omen and Exorcist and those kinds of things. But I think it was easier to slot it in because I don't know. I just feel like it was easier. I feel like there's way more crossover now than there ever was.
And is that because I don't know if we want to bring this up this episode, this elevated horror idea,
Right.
but you have directors like Robert Eggers or like Ari Aster or Jordan Peele who are rich filmmakers and they're making really high quality movies that also happen to be kind of horror movies, but we're not used to that. It's like you got your B horror slasher films
Yeah.
and you've got your Oscar winners. But now we're starting to see like the quality level is so high, but there's so many horror elements in it. It's hard, like Hereditary is a horror film, Get Out is a horror film, Nosferatu or The Witch is a horror film, but they're so elevated. And this is where I think
it's because they have so many years of figuring out what those visceral elements are to pull from.
yeah.
Like the best horror movies, my favorite horror movies are the ones that get you deep down, and they will always
Yeah.
Hereditary isn't about. I mean, it has all the supernatural stuff in it, but it's about the loss of a child.
Yeah.
Yes.
Which
Yeah.
will always be
Which you
terrifying.
guys were talking about
Yeah.
before, yeah.
Those good directors, the elevated horror stuff hits those like deep down, super visceral elements that
Yeah,
really
I would
kind
agree.
of get you. That they always will, in my opinion. Because again,
Yeah.
I never want to be stabbed. I never want to lose a child.
I agree.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like you never want to be like alone in these traumatic situations.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And that's never going to change.
Yeah. But there's stabbings in action films and there's stabbings in war films. And so it's like, yeah, what?
So in a war film, it's expected.
That's true.
You go to war, you're expecting.
That's a good point.
So if I was a soldier on a battlefield, I'm expecting to get shot.
Yeah.
If I'm sitting at my house, if I'm at my house having a shower, I'm not
Yeah.
expecting the curtain to get pulled back and get stabbed a bunch of times.
That's a fair point, yeah.
Yeah.
If someone killed my dog and I'm going to avenge his life and fight these mobsters.
When I'm on a
then
battlefield,
I
my
get stabbed.
intent is to hurt somebody.
Right.
So
Okay.
I think that's part of it.
I can buy that. I just want to quickly say too, like the power of music for operating in the horror mode. Like Speak No Evil. When I was watching that, there's a scene at a playground. And it's like two families and they're playing on a playground. Like kids are going down the slide. It's a beautiful sunny day. And it's got the creepiest, that kind of like violin music,
Yeah.
which totally had me on edge and tense. I'm like, well, there's just kids playing at a playground.
Yeah.
And if you had any other, even if you had no sound or if you had happy music, this would be like an idyllic, happy setting. But all it took was like that dark, foreboding music in this like idyllic scenario to make it feel really terrifying. So it's interesting how powerful music is too, I think, at making something feel like horror.
Well, and juxtaposing what the music is intending you to feel versus what you're seeing
Yes.
visually, right? It's that tension between what I'm seeing and what I'm feeling.
Yeah.
And again, that comes back to the skill of the director,
Yeah,
For
right?
sure.
That is a big part of it. Can I get you guys' take on a couple ones that I wrote down?
Yeah,
you
yeah.
bet.
Examples?
Examples?
Yeah.
So in the body horror genre,
hmm
Eraserhead, which is I feel like it's on a lot.
Lynch
of
is just so hard.
He's
Yeah.
very hard to nail
Yeah,
down.
I would agree.
So Eraserhead, like a psychological body horror movie, and Pink Flamingos. Would you label that as a horror movie?
I've not seen Pink Flamingos.
Yeah.
Oh, you
it's-
haven't seen?
It's
Oh.
been I think I saw that in university and I might not have been all
Okay.
there.
Eraserhead, I would say, yeah. I feel like all of Lynch's stuff, I'm just going to say, I think it's pretty much all horror.
Okay.
I think
Just
it has
because
enough-
of his intent with the way he
Yes.
Yeah.
They're always so dark, and I think he's trying to trick people. I would consider him like a horror director.
Okay.
It's on the edge, but for me, if it's David Lynch, I'm just going to mostly say it's
Okay.
horror.
And that's
I thought
John
Even
you'd
Twin
seen-
Peaks, I feel like is horror too.
John
Oh, yeah.
Waters is Pink Flamingos, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's extreme body horror kind of social
Yeah,
manipulation in the same way like Eraserhead is a lot about like sexual perversion,
Yeah,
being
yeah.
uncomfortable with those kinds of interactions and things. And Pink Flamingos is labeled as a dark comedy
Yeah.
because it's poking fun at the way society views certain groups of people.
Right.
Whereas Eraserhead is kind of trying to make you feel bad about those things.
Yeah.
Again, it's intent versus not intent, you know.
Interesting.
Like it's comedic intent, making fun of society, and then I thought you had seen Pink Flamingos. You're gonna have to go watch.
Yeah, it rings a bell. I feel like maybe I watched it in Film Site or something, but it's been so long I have to double
Okay.
check I've seen that one.
And the other, so we already covered Zombieland,
Yeah.
Shaun of the Dead. I
Yeah.
think that's a good one. But then the last one I had was American Psycho or Shutter Island.
Just gonna say Shutter Island shows up on one of my lists too.
Does it as a horror,
As a
not
horror film.
Yeah,
Yeah. I've seen it on a lot of horror lists, and because it's like once you get to the end of the movie, it's like, oh, was that a horror movie now because of what actually happened?
yeah.
Maybe that's Thriller.
Whereas Psycho is kind of the same thing, right?
Yeah.
It's a mental thing, but then the intent of American Psycho was more horrific, was it not?
Yeah, it's I'd almost have to go back and watch it again with with the purpose of figuring out whether it's a horror movie. Or
Yeah,
not.
and when you think of it, it's the movies that are probably that close that it has to come down to intent, right?
Yeah.
And what they were trying to.
So you would say
convey.
Shutter Island is a horror film?
I would say American Psycho is, and Shutter Island is not.
Oh, I agree. Yes. Agree.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Do you
the
think
song
American
was-
Psycho is a horror? I think it is for sure.
I get it. I don't know. I understand why
Why
Yeah.
it could be.
it
right.
could be.
And you've contradicted yourself so many times.
I know. I was
That's
like,
the best part.
Why
Like,
keep track of them all?
why am I even having this conversation? No, I totally get the horror elements. I just feel like it again. I feel like it's kind of like Pink Flamingos, where it's a black comedy, like
Yeah.
because there's so much satire there, and there's so much tongue in cheek.
But horror can have that, right?
It absolutely can, and that's why I'm having a hard time calling it like because there are some like ridiculous horror moments, right? But I'm thinking about the moment, where he's in the raincoat, in talking about Huey Lewis.
Yeah.
Like, how can that be a horror like scene? And it is a horror scene,
Yeah.
but then there's these. There's just some great lines and some great satire and comedy, and I'm just like, I don't know.
That's like Justin Long with measuring his way down into the basement in Barbarian. Getting,
Yeah,
measuring the
totally.
square
Yeah,
footage. I'm just
totally.
laughing my ass off when he's doing that.
I
but it's-
know.
That's
Yeah.
a good example.
Yeah.
That's a really good example. And Justin Long is like, he's becoming one of those horror
Yes.
Yeah.
actors
yes.
because he's so good at being there and
I
relaying
agree.
that,
Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
being terrified. in the
Tusk or
scene.
whatever we call that horror.
So great. I think he's good.
Yeah.
It's a good example.
Yeah, he's good.
Yeah.
That was hilarious, but the intent is to kind of like let you ease up a little bit.
Yeah, that's that you're referencing the breaking of tension.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, Shutter Island was on. So we've talked about a couple of these. Like, so this was
good
actually my horror list. So my idea that if it's mostly a procedural, then I don't consider it horror.
Mhm.
So these were ones that were on the cusp, right? Silence of the Lamb, Shutter Island, Room, not the one you're thinking
Yes.
of.
Tommy Wiseau,
Oh, that's
good
that
horror
was on-
director.
You put that out, or that was on a list of horror movies?
No, this was on a list that I came across.
That's about the woman who's like kept in a
Yes.
basement. Yeah.
That's an interesting one because again, I've never been manipulated like that by someone. But I
Exactly.
can see that if there's women out there that have, that movie would be absolutely terrifying.
Yeah, absolutely, right?
And then what was the
Cape
intent of the
Fear?
director? Yeah.
Oh yeah, I watched that a long time ago.
See, this is I think this Cape Fear is one of the hardest examples for me because in my horror elements things I have malevolence, that like feeling of unease, and that movie really does that like
Yeah.
well. Like that guy's life is hell because of Robert De Niro,
Yeah.
what he's doing to him. So then, and I think that was the intent of the director. So I would probably say that that's absolutely
Fatal Attraction.
that's
Thriller.
That's
Despite the Rabbit, I think it's Thriller.
Fatal Attraction. What am I thinking of?
It's
Glenn Close and
Oh,
Michael
Glenn Close.
Douglas.
I'm thinking.
Hand that rocks the
Basic
cradle.
Instinct.
Basic Instinct.
Sorry.
Yeah, well, many of those show up on. I mean, those are '80s erotic thrillers. Is
Yeah.
technically the
Thrillers, yeah.
category.
And those have a
right?
lot of horror elements,
They
but
do.
They do.
Are they quite
The
horror?
malevolence, the unease.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, the other one, I Death Proof showed up on this list.
Oh, yeah.
and I don't know, like
That's the Tarantino's car one.
yeah.
I think that's like a slasher.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think so too.
He's like a serial killer, right?
Yeah.
Serial
So
killer
what?
movies are very difficult.
This is for Jay the Dead. What about Terminator? Because he is hunting Sarah Connor's the whole movie, he's like this super killer. He's not that different than like a Jason or a Michael Myers, just hunting relentlessly, killing people left, right, and center in the wake. It's gory, it's dark, it's thrilling. Do we call that is that a slasher film, Terminator?
I would have to watch that with that in mind.
I watched the trailer thinking, I don't think so. And then I want to watch the trailer, like, oh, this actually does feel a lot like a horror film.
Yeah, see, so I was just gonna say, and then I'll let you get in there. Like to me, it was never. I never thought of it as a horror film, whereas Alien, I always did.
That's a huge contradiction.
And I don't know. I can't see Terminator as a horror film. But
They're
I
both
get
sci-fi. They both have hunters killing.
I know. I get the contradiction.
It's a weird. It's hard to say either way because I think sometimes horror elements are used to manipulate the audience into feeling a certain way for a short amount of time. So even though there might be enough pieces in Terminator to have like a horrific trailer and make it feel that way, I think certain directors use those elements in a way to kind of just push you towards a direction. Like Shutter Island is a good example because, I mean, the entire movie is a manipulation. It's not actually horrific things that are happening. It's a manipulation to make you feel a certain way and then to get that like aha at the end.
Totally.
So then it's not, to me, that's not a horror movie.
Yeah.
Because the overall intent of the movie was just to get you. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And there was horrific elements in there that are just manipulation.
And it would be interesting to go back and watch a lot of these films through that lens because in many cases here we're talking about films that maybe we haven't seen in a decade or more.
Yeah.
It's difficult.
So it would be interesting to go back and watch some of these through that lens.
And it depends what time in your life you watch something.
Yes, for sure. Absolutely.
Like even what was the Sam Raimi one you mentioned earlier?
Drag Me to Hell?
Drag Me to Hell. So when I watched that for the first time, I was actually my departure from, I was just kind of getting out of my religion and exploring horror movies and like prying my eyes open to watch certain things. And when I watched Drag Me to Hell, I was terrified.
Yeah.
Like absolutely like pinned to my seat, terrified. And now if I went back and watched
if you've been sheltered your whole childhood to stay away from those types of films, and then you jump into Drag Me to Hell, even though it's comedic in a lot of ways, it's pretty
scary.
Yeah. And at that time in my life, that was a terrifying horror movie.
I've shown that to students because it's almost PG in terms of the content, but it has those scary adrenaline pumping moments. So it was a good one to show.
Those are the grade 4s or was it
grade 3s actually? Yeah. Okay. I was TOCing that day. I needed something to do.
That's
right. So I don't know. I feel like maybe have we kind of? I mean, you're welcome, audience. I think we've solved the problem of what is a horror film.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, we can very clear line about what is and what isn't. So now you know. You can thank us. You're welcome.
And it's interesting. Go back, like if there's movies that you didn't think were horror, you thought were horror, go back and watch them again. Yeah. I think there's a lot to be said about rewatching movies that you enjoy and trying to find elements, watch them from a different perspective. Like I've watched what's the new Fall of the House of Usher. I've already watched it 3 times.
Holy cow! Yeah, I want to go back and watch it, but it's so good.
If you enjoy it, I mean, again, is that horror? It's not. It's not a movie, but. You watch it for like the cinematography first, then you watch it for the acting, then you watch it for the background stuff.
Yeah.
Go back and do that and see if something is horror or not. Like try and find.
We could do a whole season of is it horror and choose all borderline films that are like kind of on the cusp.
Try and see what the intent was. You know what the different elements that are in there to try and make you feel a certain way.
It's so interesting to me the idea of because I've had this conversation with my wife about she's not one to go back and rewatch films, and I'm like. I can't wrap my head around it because there will be a film that I've watched 6 times, but it's like, I'm kind of in the mood for this. Mm-hmm. And I know that that's going to satisfy that need.
That's true. Unlike an unknown film where you don't know what you're going to get. If you know what you want, you at least know what you're going to get. Yeah.
And I also think for a film that I believe is really good, going back and watching for a different element or seeing things, I never saw that before, or seeing how things fit together or whatever. Like there's just... With a good film, there's so much richness of what you can pull out of it every time you watch it. And then just the sheer enjoyment of, I know what's coming and I know that I'm going to enjoy this. So I never understand people who are like, I watch it once. And reading's the same for me. I can read the book more than once if I know that it's good and I'm going to be satisfied at the end.
For me, I'm too slow. Reading a book takes too long, but watching a movie again is...
fair enough.
So like a movie but words?
I just find like I'm not a fast reader, so for me to reread a 1,000-page book is like a huge investment. Whereas like
Yeah.
rewatching an hour and a half
No,
film
I
is
agree.
just less. Yeah,
I just don't read.
yeah, fair enough. Yeah. Me neither,
A
really.
good recent example of something to rewatch is like The Lighthouse. Like rewatch
Yeah.
that with knowing the intent was to make you feel super uncomfortable the whole thing, and realize that it's framed to make you feel claustrophobic.
Yeah.
The droning sounds to make you feel uneasy, like you can never rest. And those can like watching movies.
That's another
like
one
that,
that's on the border. Like some
It's-
people say it's horror, some people say it's not.
and I absolutely think it's horror because I
Okay.
think every element of that movie is trying to make you feel uncomfortable, uneasy, and just is trying to really make those visceral elements sink in and watch the movie in a certain way. It's very manipulative.
Yeah, you bring up another good point too, that there's directors who in your mind are sort of horror directors, and so you kind of assume
Yeah, with-
like after doing The Witch, like okay, like
Yeah.
The Lighthouse, you almost go into it with a horror lens because that's what you're expecting. Just like Ari Aster, it's like, hey, he did Midsummer, he did Hereditary. Beau is Afraid. I think you're wanting to look for horror elements
Yeah.
because you're thinking of it as
Right.
Ari Aster. I'm going into this expecting horror elements, but the first film he ever made was Beau is Afraid. Then you might never even think it was a
Exactly.
horror film. Like it's interesting how much having a director who you lump into a certain category can also impact maybe how you receive it.
And it's great because good directors then use that and manipulate you, and they get you. Like I sit down to watch Beau's Afraid, and the first 15, 20 minutes where you're kind of pinned to your seat
Yes.
with all anxiety,
Yes.
it's like you're ready for something so bad to happen because of who the director is.
Yes, exactly.
And you know he's sitting in his director's chair somewhere being like, they're going to feel so
Yeah.
shitty after this.
Exactly. I think Jordan Peele too was the one he did in the summer.
Sorry?
That was the most recent Jordan Peele one.
Oh, not Get Out. What was it called? Not Up. What was it called?
I know, I can't remember.
It's like one word title. It's like
Yeah.
Up or
Nope.
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 There you go.
Yeah.
yeah.
Again, like Jordan Peele, I think I went into it expecting more horror, and then I was a bit let down. Like, oh, that didn't have as much horror as I was wanting.
Yeah.
It's weird, right?
Because with Us and Get Out, it's like, yeah,
Yeah.
I come to Jordan Peele now wanting horror.
Yeah. Back to the definition of fun. The definition I came up with, we had to talk off camera about why
You said My Little Pony Friendship is magic.
the funnest movie ever. Fun to me is a positive expectation met. So your expectation of that movie was for it to be horror. If that's not met, then you didn't
Yeah.
have fun.
Yes.
It's not a good movie.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So and smart directors, good directors use that and just like punch you with it.
I mean, I didn't have fun watching Cannibal Holocaust.
No.
No, but that was definitely
Because
horror.
you didn't expect it to be like so gnarly.
Oh, it was just so brutal. I just
Yeah.
didn't enjoy it. And knowing the animal brutality part was real too kind of turned me off.
Oh yeah, I never. Please stop doing that.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess they have, but then when you look at things through that lens, then you can enjoy movies like Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey, because my expectation is that this movie is going to be so trash, and you
Yeah,
don't watch
fair.
it for the filmmaking, you don't watch it for the creatures. I'm watching it to try and figure out what is going on in these directors' minds.
Okay, yeah, that's
Yeah.
true. We'll just come into it. Any movie with the right expectation, you can
Yeah.
enjoy.
Yeah,
it.
totally.
Because
Yeah.
they're trying to manipulate something else there. I don't know what it is, but
That's
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah.
So is this a good point to transition to our final segment here?
I think
We're
so.
Getting a bit
Yeah.
long.
Yeah.
We could talk about this for 2 more hours.
I think so.
yeah, I
easily.
can talk about it
Yeah.
all day.
But all right. So our final segment here, we thought it would be fun to give our top 5 most anticipated films of 2024, horror films. We'll see if they are defined as horror when we talk about them. So, do you want me to go first? We can have
I'm
save our
excited to see
guest
how
for
many
last.
Yeah,
overlappers there are here.
Okay. So we're not going to do a whole thing. We'll just say, so my number 5 is The Watchers by Ishana Night Shyamalan. I'm
Oh, yeah,
mostly just
yeah.
anticipating this because I'm really curious to see. This is M. Night Shyamalan's daughter. This is her directorial debut.
Oh,
So I'm kind of curious to see what her
Yeah,
style
I
is
was
like.
too.
is he producing it or something? Is he like? helping
I think
out?
he's helping with it in some
Yeah.
capacity, but she's the director, and it looks like it's being billed as a horror film.
I think so. Yeah.
So I'm curious to see Ishana Night Shyamalan. That's my number 5. Number 4, Nosferatu, Robert Eggers, which I'm sure will be on
Yep.
perhaps other lists. Number 3 is Alien, Romulus. This is directed by Fede Alvarez, who did the Evil Dead remake. I really like the
Oh.
Evil Dead remake. So I like the Aliens franchise. There's been some
Yeah,
not so
hit
good
and
ones,
miss,
but
yeah.
I'm hopeful that Fede Alvarez will do a good job with that one. Number 2, Terrifier 3. The Christmas Terrifier
Yeah.
by Damien Leone. And my number 1 is Maxine XXX with Mia Goth and Ty West, third in the series.
There you go.
Good
Yep.
list. to watch here, so I'm going to check that out.
Yeah, Leatherface.
So my number 5 is the Crow remake.
Nice.
I was really taken with that film in the 90s. And so I'm really curious to see how, and I really like Skarsgård. So I'm cautiously optimistic that
Was
they'll
Brandon
do,
Lee killed on the set of that movie?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What Skarsgård is playing? The
The youngest, it, Bill.
Bill, yeah.
Yeah. And I think he's really good in everything I've seen him in.
Mm.
So I'm looking forward to what he does with the part.
Mm-hmm.
So my number 4 is Terrifier 3.
Nice.
And I'm just going to say that despite the fact, like I've gone back and watched All Hallows Eve and Terrifier 2, because I think Art the Clown is introduced in All Hallows Eve.
Yes.
It's a train wreck that I can't take my eyes off of. I'm actually horrified by Terrifier 2 in some
I didn't like it that much.
I didn't like it that much, but now I'm like, but I gotta see 3 just to see how far over the top do they go. So my number that was my number 4. Number 3 is Maxine.
Yep.
Number 2, Salem's Lot,
Oh yeah. Nice.
and number 1 is Nosferatu.
Not Blood and Honey too.
No, it didn't quite make the list.
Oh,
I
that
think it
would
was
be
just
your number
number
1 for
6.
sure.
Yeah.
All right, and Aaron the Knife Jabs.
Yeah, so number 5, I got Abigail. It's by Matt Bettedly Open. It's the director of VHS Southbound.
Oh,
the
okay.
Screamer
Cool.
movies. It's still super early in production. It's supposed to be coming out this year, but just based on the director,
Interesting.
Nice.
excited to
pick,
see what
yeah.
he's doing next. Then I have The Toxic Avenger, the remake.
That was supposed to come out this year, wasn't it?
I'm super excited about
It's
it.
got
Elijah Wood. is
and
starring.
from
and
Game of Thrones. What's his name? Tyrion.
Oh yeah. Oh, I have it right
Peter
here.
Dinklage,
And
Peter
Kevin
Dinklage.
Bacon as well.
Oh, wow.
So great cast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great horror cast, and it's directed by Macon Blair, who was in Green Room and he starred in Blue Ruin. Have you guys seen Blue Ruin?
No.
It's not a horror movie. Again.
Or is it?
It's like one of the best revenge movies ever.
Nice.
He wrote it. He's writing and directing this. So super excited about that
Cool.
one. And then I have Late Night with the Devil, which is like just a really interesting concept and has a really great character actor in it. It's based off of like kind of a failing talk show, has someone that's possessed. On the
Oh, I
talk
heard
show.
someone else talking about this one. Yeah.
Yeah, and
That
it's
does sound good.
David. I hope I don't butcher this. Dastamalachian. He played Pokemon or Polka Dot Man in Suicide Squad, and he was in Dune, Oppenheimer, Blade Runner. He's been in everything.
Oh yes, I know.
Kind of
Yeah.
background guy. He's super fantastic. And then Maxine, I think everyone wants to see
Yeah.
that. And Nosferatu, because it's Robert
Nice.
Eggers and he can do no wrong.
Nice. Yeah. So we had some crossovers and some ones
did,
I hadn't
yeah.
heard of. So
Nice.
awesome. Well, thank you for listening and watching. Hopefully,
Yeah, I hope you enjoyed this conversation because we've been dying to have this conversation for a long time.
Thanks
Yeah.
for having me on too, by the way.
Yeah, thank
yeah,
you.
it was great to have Aaron on. If you have any thoughts about what is horror, what is not horror, or if there's films you feel like we got wrong or didn't get wrong, or even if you just want to point out all the inconsistencies in Leatherface Lee's logic, you can email us at dudesthedead@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you, or if you have any other good examples of things that may or may not be horror. If you're watching this on YouTube, also you can put it in the comments. Yeah, thanks very much for coming on today as a
Yeah,
special
absolutely.
guest.
It's
Appreciate
so
that.
great to have you.
Is there anything else in conclusion? This is our 50th episode, so thank you for sticking with us, whether you've been listening from episode 1 or just listening for a few, or whether you're a listener from the future.
Exactly.
Thanks for listening
Exactly.
regardless.
Yes. Thanks for listening, and
We'll see you in the aisles.